What is your biggest financial concern? Are you being as intentional with your finances as you could be? How confident are you that you'll reach your financial goals? How will life's transitions impact your financial plan? Welcome to the Clarity and Confidence for Life podcast with Tom Fleishel, founder, president, and CEO of Fleishel Financial Associates. Discover how we can help business owners, successful families, and corporate executives achieve clarity and confidence for life while providing tailored financial solutions that eliminate complexity and free you up to focus on what really matters in life to you and your family. Now, on to the show.
Hello and welcome to the Clarity and Confidence for Life podcast with your host, Tom Fleishel. I'm RJ Malik, producer of this podcast. Tom, good to see you. How are you doing?
Fantastic. Thank you so much, RJ.
All right. So on this podcast, you'll be comparing the proposed plans of our two main presidential candidates.
That's true. Absolutely. I think it's a very, very interesting time that we live in, and a lot of big questions are wanting to be answered. So I'm looking forward to diving in with this.
All right. So what do you say we start off with taxes, tariffs, regulation, and the deficit? What do we know about the U.S. presidential candidates' economic proposals and their implications for investors?
So here we are today, only 12 days away from this election. The polls are extremely tight, and most observers are kind of tired of hearing about and talking about this election, but it remains, I think, important for the global economy, and it's going to have real big impact for investors. It's also significant for markets as the two candidates' policy proposals differ quite a bit on taxes, trade, and regulation. So we can make, some of their stated positions, what are the chances of them becoming policy, and what might be their impact. But one thing I want to say to start out with is looking back at previous election outcomes, policy doesn't matter as much as the underlying economic backdrop. This is according to Jeffrey Schultz, who's the managing director and head of economic and market strategy for a company called ClearBridge. So with the exception of Republican President George W. Bush, looking back at the last 9 presidents, going back to Republican President Gerald Ford, each administration saw double-digit annualized returns during their terms. So yes, policies do matter, but it's more about the economic backdrop and how that is coming with companies and their earnings and things like that.
Interesting. Okay. Then what are the two candidates' tax proposals?
So there's 2 elements of the tax proposals we're going to need to look at. First is personal and corporate. On the personal taxes, the differences are important as the U.S. consumer, a major engine for the economy, could be materially affected. So Donald Trump says he wants to extend the personal tax cuts passed in 2017, which are due to expire at the end of next year, 2025, and thus would be a major tax increase for most Americans. Those cuts came in the form of higher standard deductions, a lower top marginal rate, more generous child tax credits, and lower estate taxes. Now, while Vice President Kamala Harris has not been real clear or explicit, the Biden administration previously suggested extending many of the 2017 cuts, but only for those earning less than $400,000 a year. Harris also said she wants to expand housing tax credits, and probably the most eye-catching difference on the personal taxes is Harris's, quote, billionaire minimum tax, a Biden plan to tax unrealized capital gains on wealth exceeding $100 million. Well, maybe you and I might not make in that category, but it might affect some people.
Yes. And that could, unfortunately, I think that could be a trickle down effect, but we'll see. You never know.
Yes.
So we'll move on. What about corporate taxes? Can you talk a little bit about that?
So some real clear differences, for sure, on the corporate taxes. Harris would look to raise the corporate tax rate from 21 to 28%. Again, this is a proposal floated by either President Biden. There are also clear differences on corporate taxes. Harris would look to raise the corporate rate from 21 to 28%. Again, this is a proposal floated earlier by President Biden. Trump has proposed lowering it to 15%, at least for companies that manufacture their products here in the U.S. So a cut or a hike of these proportions would be a huge deal. A 1 percentage point change in the corporate tax rate could add or subtract just under 1% of S&P index earnings. So that's pretty significant. Thus, a 5 percentage point move up or down could move the 2025 S&P earnings from the current consensus of plus 15% to either plus 5% or plus 20%, all else being equal. So
All
some
right.
pretty
Okay, go ahead. I'm sorry for interrupting.
No, it's just that yeah, those corporate tax rates are going to be extremely important for corporate earnings for sure.
Okay, very good. Then what are their views on international trade?
So there is some quite a bit of difference on trade and business regulation. They're pretty stark, importantly driven more by the executive branch administrative action and not necessarily subject to congressional approvals. So Harris looks again to retain much of the Biden administration's approach, which has been specifically targeted against China's growing dominance of global supply chains. Allies of the U.S. tend to get a lighter touch, but there are modest barriers around specific technologies and sectors. So we look at Trump's proposals, they're more broad-based and protectionist. Coming into last week, we knew about proposals to impose 60% tariffs on all goods from China and 10% on all other imports. At the Economic Club of Chicago recently, he raised that rhetoric, particularly on autos. Terrible about this whole type of thing. Other countries impose tariffs much higher than we do right now. So it's not a free trade situation. We might think we're getting free trade, but other countries are penalizing the U.S. imports where we're really leaving a much more free market economy. So, national security gives the president some scope to impose tariffs without approval from Congress, as Trump did on aluminum and steel in 2018. But it also seems likely that Trump's more aggressive trade proposals are conceived as a starting point for negotiation.
Well, that makes sense. He's a negotiator.
That's right. That's what he does.
What about the proposed ideas on regulation?
So again, there's some two important areas for markets: antitrust policy and the permitting process. Don't want to get too technical here, but it's expected that a Harris administration would be broadly consistent with Biden's on both fronts. The current antitrust approach has been characterized by their big efforts to block mergers and potentially break up companies. There seems to be a broad attitude of fighting bigness versus bigly for the permitting process. Critical to adding new capacity in the manufacturing, energy, and power sectors. We're probably going to see little change in an area that has been a frustrating topic for private sector operators. So Trump is perceived as more business friendly. He's less resistant to M&A, mergers and acquisitions, and more of a relaxed, laissez-faire attitude on regulation, particularly the federal permitting process, and this for energy and infrastructure projects.
It seems like regulations just keep growing and growing and growing, and there has to be a point in time where you have to look at some of these regulations that were put in years ago that maybe can be just dismissed or just, changed because of the fact that we've progressed so much in the last 30 years.
Yeah, it's got to be a cutback and a rollback of some of these regulations. This is interesting what's happening with Elon Musk getting very involved in the political world, and maybe some thoughts of if Trump gets elected, he might become the czar, or the, what do you call him, the in charge of cost cutting. Imagine,
Okay.
Imagine what he could do to cut some things in federal government. So,
Well,
yeah, it's going to be very interesting to watch how all this unfolds.
Well, look at all the cost cutting he did after he took over Twitter. I mean, that was amazing. I think, if I remember correctly, I could be wrong, but for some reason, the number 80% is stuck in my head, that he just basically cut 80% of the people that were working there.
Yeah, that might be scary to some, but I mean, look, we've got a bloated government. It's way overfunded. It's too many things going on with government regulation that are really inhibiting growth in this country. Obviously, we need regulations for certain things. We need to curb the bad guys and keep things under control. But it's just, if we're going to have an open market economy, and we need to have free trade, if we need to put limitations on how governments can control things so that we have a more balanced environment of growth and curbing the bad guys.
Okay, if you don't mind, a question just popped into my head. We were talking about how the tariffs on us compared to the tariffs that we put on other countries. Is it too simplistic to say, well, let's just have everyone have the same amount. Is that too simplistic?
Yeah, it's probably too simplistic to say that, every country is going to be a little different in terms of their views and what they're trying to export and import versus how they manufacture things. We've been way too dependent upon other countries for goods to manufacture here in the U.S. We need to be able to manufacture more things locally, but the cost of doing business in the U.S., look at what's happening with the unions and the rising costs of keeping them happy with. So it's much cheaper to manufacture parts, let's say in China or Indonesia or other countries where their labor costs are ridiculously low compared to what they are here in the U.S. So that's been the challenge, is how do we balance all that out by keeping U.S. manufacturing costs competitive at the same time made in the U.S. being the priority. So those are the two challenges.
It gets more complicated than the way you laid it out. So that is something that probably would take a lot of time and effort. And I would think that we could try something and see how it works, not with okay, we're going to do this and that's it, and then we keep it going for years on end. I think the approach of just saying, okay, we're going to do plan A, but look at it for a year and then make adjustments after that. Is that more of a common sense approach?
Absolutely. Yeah. One size doesn't fit all. That's for sure.
Okay. Let's move on. What are the chances of either views being limited by divided government?
Well, there's always anxiety in the markets when change is coming. We call it climbing the wall of worry. Kind of the market still right now, climbing the wall of worry. There's all kinds of things we could be worried about. Geopolitical events, exogenous events in the world, things we don't expect that might happen. Either way, there'll be a different person occupying the White House. So we do, see a high probability of either candidate's more views that are becoming law. Now, we think it's likely we'll see a divided government with the Democrats maybe retaining the House of Representatives and the Republicans taking the Senate. So as a result, Congress is likely to apply its reins to whoever wins the presidency. So it's a toss-up. A lot of things can happen. We're just not sure. But I definitely think there'll probably be some kind of a divided government, even if we get a Republican president, something in either Democrat or Republican Congress. So we'll see where that falls.
My personal opinion, and I want to qualify that, I think a divided government works best.
Yes, it does. Yes, it does.
My opinion. It's you need to have that situation where we can put the brakes on and not just have, one party just rolling over everyone. I like a divided government. So
that's right.
That's what I'm hoping for this coming election. All right, let's keep moving on. What's the differences in their debt and deficit spending programs?
So probably most importantly, neither candidate appears to be willing to address the U.S. debt substantially, in their programs. There seems to be a little appetite to cut defense or entitlement spending. That's entitlements. That's the death knell for any politician. Who's going to cut Social Security? Who's going to cut Medicare? Who's going to cut those benefits? But that's where some of the major budget expenses are really eaten away. Of course, the biggest one, I just heard this morning that our national debt interest is $1 trillion a year just to pay the national debt interest. So those are huge impacts on, what's happening with our economy, what's going to happen in the future. So two of the three biggest elements of the federal budget, interest expense, and that's the one I just mentioned, being the other. So that's huge. Economists' projections show only a modest difference in the deficit under each candidate over the next 5 years. Broadly speaking, Harris's proposals show a deficit neutral redistribution from corporate and higher income taxpayers to lower income taxpayers, the redistribution of wealth. Trump's programs may result in a slight deficit reduction, assuming tariff revenues can offset lower taxes. Again, divided government is expected to soften the effect of either president's proposals, and in both cases, slightly improve the debt outlook.
I think we need more than just a slight improvement. We seem to be heading towards a major problem. The deficit just keeps growing and growing and growing, and at some point, something's got to give.
Well, how do countries fall? You look back over history, it's moral decay, and then it's deficit spending and government debt that they can't manage. And so, Unfortunately, we're kind of going on that direction in both fronts, and this country really needs to turn around. I sure hope and pray that we can see some changes that are going to people be more responsible fiscally. Term limits may seem to be really the answer because these people get in and they want a perpetual career for 40 years and they don't answer to the public anymore. They're just trying to protect their interests. So I definitely think, put my personal plug in there, that we definitely need term limits so that it's not a career. It's a 2-year term limit. People can come in and hopefully make a difference and then move on and do something else. So they're not trying to look out after their interests. They're going to basically focused on their constituents and their needs.
Well, when you look back on history, when the country first started, you didn't have career politicians. I mean, our first president, George Washington, just did one term. So, and all the others.
He had to be begged to run. He didn't want to run.
No, yeah. I know that. And a lot of the other, not only presidents, but the, representatives and the senators, they did not stay forever. They would go back to their business and go back to their families and things like that. So you can look back on history and say, well, we did pretty well when we did have people not being lifetime politicians. So that is something I'm with you on that. So we'll see how that goes. All right, let's move on. How do we look on the current economic and market fronts?
So right now, it's surprisingly, interestingly good. The macroeconomic picture is still positive. The growth and inflation have slowed from breakneck paces. The recent Atlanta Fed's GDP new model is projecting third quarter GDP growth at 3.2%, which is very healthy, annualized. And consumer spending seems similarly resilient, with year-over-year growth tracking at 2% for goods and 3% for services. Year over year, U.S. inflation has decreased to 2.7. So that's come down quite a bit. It was 9% in the last couple of years.
Yes.
That's huge. But still, we've probably seen a 20% increase over the last 4 years of inflation for goods and services. So that's what's been eating people's lunch right now. The third quarter earnings season continued last week with 14% of the S&P companies reporting, and the index's blended growth rate for the quarter is about 3.4%. So we're nearing some major events over the next 2 weeks. This presidential election on November 5th, the Federal Open Market Committee meeting on November 6th and 7th will set the tone for the remainder of the year. Subsequent weeks will likely be focused on macro events. The markets have some tailwinds, but we will likely see some volatility.
And sometimes volatility is not a bad thing.
Yes, it can be good in one sense, but people just don't like the uncertainty and volatility.
Sure.
We call it the VIX measure. It's the measure of volatility. And so when that starts cranking up, people get nervous. And so we can probably expect some of that because the markets just don't like uncertainty.
Okay, very good. All right, moving on to the next topic. What impact on the markets and economy do you see from the election? Will there be a higher level of uncertainty and market volatility? We sort of touched on that, so you can continue.
So again, the broad brush interpretation of all these policies, positions is that a Trump administration would result in faster growth but higher inflation. A Harris administration would result in less growth and inflation, and divided government would probably split that difference. Now let's talk about for investors. A Trump victory might be expected to benefit what we call the small cap companies that are more nimble, and some mid cap companies, and sectors that are more sensitive to regulation, such as energy, power, industrials, and financials. It could be uncomfortable for bonds and fixed income, as inflationary concerns create more volatility for bonds, and they can be affected more dramatically. A Harris victory would be more of a continuation of current policies, perhaps resulting in investors' attention reverting to the wider economic environment. So, kind of to wrap up here, a contested or delayed result would be a real problem. I hope that's not going to be the case. I hope it's a real clear victory for whoever is going to be elected, because the S&P declined almost 12% from election day to mid-December after the Bush-Gore 2000 debacle, when in Florida we had the hanging chads problem.
Yes, I remember.
You remember that?
Yeah,
the
unfortunately,
hanging chads and counting over and over and over again. And although many factors were at play, it really created a lot of stress and anxiety and uncertainty, and the markets just were going up in an upheaval during that time period. But history suggests that once the result is known, a relief rally, we call it, is likely to greet whoever enters the White House. So, in essence, let's all buckle our safety belts the next few weeks and potentially months. It's going to be quite a riot.
The market seems to be able to adjust once they know who's there, and then after that, we sort of follow. Is that a
yeah?
good...
That's been the general rule, as I mentioned earlier, in the show, that did say it's more of the economic backdrop that really matters, not so much policy. Those do have an impact, but again, we want to make sure that economics are really the key that needs to be addressed, and the economic conditions of this country. A lot of it's just driven by how new innovations and companies coming up with new ideas. Think of the innovations that are coming out with artificial intelligence,
right,
and how that's impacting things. It's so unknown right now where that's all going to go. A lot of it may be hype, but I think a lot of it is really going to bring efficiencies to our economy. So there's always hope. There's always going to be people that build profitable companies with new innovative ideas. There's always going to be investors that want to invest in those companies. So that's why we kind of have to keep our heads on and not lose our heads during these kinds of things that could really cause us to make emotional, knee-jerk, ad hoc reactions and bad decisions. So we just need to stay the course. Don't get overly excited about all this, and just stay focused.
Okay, that sounds good, Tom. Appreciate the advice. And how can people contact you?
Well, the best way is to reach out on our website, which is www.fleishelfinancial.com. Or they can call our number at 386-738-1800.
Very good. And most importantly, thank you for listening to the Clarity and Confidence for Life podcast. We ask you to share this podcast, rate it, and leave a review, because this actually helps others find the show. Again, thank you for listening. And for everyone at Clarity and Confidence for Life, I'm RJ Malik, and we look forward to you joining us for the next podcast.
Thank you for listening to the Clarity and Confidence for Life podcast. Click the subscribe button to be notified of new episodes when they become available. The information covered and posted represents the views and opinions of the hosts and/or guests, and does not necessarily represent the views or opinions of Raymond James. This content has been made available for informational and educational purposes only. The content is not intended to be a substitute for professional financial advice. Always seek the advice of your financial advisor or other qualified financial service providers with any questions you may have regarding your individual situation. Securities are offered through Raymond James Financial Services Incorporated, member FINRA, and SIPC. Investment advisory services offered through Raymond James Financial Services Advisors Incorporated. Fleishel Financial Associates is not a broker-dealer and is independent of Raymond James Financial Services.